This is part 1 of LINQ tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss what's LINQ, benefits of using LINQ, LINQ architecture, and different LINQ providers that are available. So what's LINQ? LINQ stands for Language Integrated Query. LINQ enables us to query any type of data store, be it SQL Server, XML documents, objects in memory like list of customer, list of order, arrays, etc., be it entities or be it data sets. Why should we use LINQ? What are the benefits of using LINQ? To understand this, let's say we are developing a .NET application, and this .NET application requires to fetch data from different data sources like databases, XML documents, and from in-memory objects like list of customer, list of order, arrays, etc. Now for a developer who is working on this application, for him to be able to fetch data from these different data sources, he has to understand the technologies and the syntax that is specific to the underlying data source. For example, to be able to retrieve data from a SQL Server database, he needs to understand ADO.NET and transact SQL that is specific to SQL Server database. Similarly, to be able to retrieve data from an XML document, the developer has to understand XPath and XSLT, and to be able to fetch data from in-memory objects, the developer has to know how arrays and generics work. LINQ enables us to work with these different data sources using a similar programming style without having the need to know the syntax and the technologies that are specific to the underlying data source. And another benefit of using LINQ is that it provides IntelliSense and compile time error checking as well. We'll discuss an example of that in just a bit, but before that, let's look at the architecture of LINQ. Now we all know that we can develop a .NET application in any .NET supported programming language like C#, VB or J#. Similarly, a LINQ query can also be written using any of this .NET supported programming language. Now between the actual LINQ query and the actual underlying data source, there is another component called LINQ provider. And it is the responsibility of the LINQ provider to convert that LINQ query into a format that the underlying data source can understand. Now, let's say the application is trying to fetch data from SQL Server database. If that's the case, this LINQ query will be fed into a LINQ provider called LINQ to SQL, which is going to convert that LINQ query into transact SQL that the underlying SQL Server database can understand. Similarly, if the LINQ query has to fetch data from an XML document, the same LINQ query is going to be fed into this LINQ to XML provider, which is going to convert that LINQ query into XPath, which the underlying XML document can understand. Similarly, we have different LINQ providers like LINQ to objects, LINQ to entities, LINQ to data set. We even have third-party LINQ providers like, for example, LINQ to Twitter. So if we want to query Twitter, we can use LINQ to Twitter. Similarly, we have LINQ to Amazon, LINQ to Google, etc. Now, let's look at an example of using LINQ. But before that, let's actually write some ADO.NET code, see what are the problems with that, and then we'll try and rewrite the same example using LINQ. So let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio. So this is the table that we'll be using for the demo. So here we have both male and female students. All we want to do is write ADO.NET code to retrieve only male students and then display them within the grid view control. And to achieve that, I have already created an empty ASP.NET Web Application project here, and all I have done so far is within the web.config file, I have a connection string here which points to this sample database, and I also have a web form 1 here where I have dragged and dropped a grid view control, and within the code behind file I have brought in the required ADO.NET namespaces, and here you see the regular ADO.NET code. Now I'm not going to discuss the specific details of ADO.NET here because we have already discussed that in ADO.NET video series. So if you're new to ADO.NET, please watch videos from ADO.NET video tutorial. So what are we doing here? We are reading the connection string from web.config file, and using that connection string we are building the SQL connection object, and then here we have the actual SQL command that we want to be executed against SQL Server. So ADO.NET and this is the transact SQL that is specific to SQL Server database. Look at the query itself. The query is straightforward. We are saying select all these columns from students table where gender equals male. Now this query is buried inside this opaque string, which means here notice that we don't have any form of IntelliSense. And since we don't have IntelliSense here, this query is error prone, meaning we can make some spelling mistakes. For example, instead of first name, we could very easily misspell it as first name 1. And that's the SQL query, right? And then here we're constructing list of students, and here we have the actual student class. So this student class is straightforward with ID, first name, last name, and gender properties. Okay, now so we are constructing list of students here, opening the connection, executing the command, and then we are looping through the reader object. And while we are looping through, we are creating an instance of student, and then we are retrieving data from the reader and populating the respective properties of the student object, adding the student object to the list, closing the connection, and then we are setting that list of students as the data source for the grid view control and invoking data bind. So let's quickly run this and see if it works. So it should be able to fetch only the male students, and that's what we see here. Now since we don't have IntelliSense inside this opaque string, it's very easy to make a spelling mistake like that. And if we do that and look at this, when we build the solution, we notice the status bar here, we don't have any compilation error. Okay, it says build succeeded. But when we actually run this at runtime, notice that we are going to have that error. So regular ADO.NET, since the queries are buried inside opaque strings, we don't have IntelliSense or we don't have compile time error checking. With LINQ we get that as well. Now let's see how to rewrite the same example using LINQ. Okay, for that let's actually delete this webform1.aspx, and let's add webform1 again, and let's set font family here to Arial, and let's drag and drop a grid view control. Okay, now let's get to the code behind file. Now we need to add another component here that's called LINQ to SQL classes. We'll discuss LINQ to SQL in detail in a later video session, but for now let's go ahead and add a new item and click on the data tab under install the template, select LINQ to SQL classes, and let's call this sample.dbml and click add. Okay, so now let's open the Server Explorer. So using this we are going to connect to actual SQL Server database from Visual Studio, and right click on data connections and select this option, add connection. So here specify your server name. I'm working with local installation of SQL Server here, so I can specify dot, and then here we should be able to see the list of databases that are available. Or you can also give the name of the server. Here the name of SQL Server on my machine, it is Venkat-PC, and I'm going to use Windows authentication to connect to that SQL server, and we want to work with sample database. Okay, so that should add a connection to SQL Server from Visual Studio, and then once we expand tables we should be able to see the students table. So now we're going to drag and drop the student table onto this designer surface, which is going to generate student class for us. Okay, so within the sample.designer.cs file we should see a class for student. Now we are not going to get into the specifics of LINQ to SQL here. We'll discuss that in detail in a later video session. So all we have done so far is generated a class for student table. Okay, and then within our code behind file we are going to write a LINQ query. Now another thing that we need to understand here is, in addition to the actual student class, we also have something called sample data context here. So this is the gateway into the database. So we have to create an instance of the sample data context class in order to be able to retrieve data from the sample database. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do within the code behind file is to create an instance of that class, sample data context. Let's call this data context equals new sample data context. Now what we want to do is retrieve data from SQL Server database using a LINQ query. Okay, so and whatever that LINQ query is going to return, we are going to set that as the data source for the grid view control. Okay, so with the LINQ query, we first write the from keyword. So from, okay, and then we specify name of a variable here. Let's call it student. Okay, and now we specify our actual source. Where are the students present now? Students are present in this data context. So data context dot students. Okay, and now we don't want all the students. If we want all the students, we can simply say select student. Okay, and then when we say gridview1.databind, so when we run this, we should get all the students because we are not filtering them. So we have all the male and female students. Okay, now if we want to filter them, we use a where keyword. So where student dot gender equals, we only want male employees. Okay, so this query, this LINQ query right here, should return male employees that are present in students table. So let's quickly run this and see if that's what is the output that we get. So notice that we only get male students. And again, notice that here we have IntelliSense as well. The moment I say student dot, it shows all the properties of the student object. Okay, now if I misspell, for example, gender to gender1, and then if I try to build this solution, notice that we'll get to know about that at the compile time itself. So we have, IntelliSense and compile time error checking. Okay, but with ADO.NET we don't have that because the queries are buried inside that opaque strings where we don't have IntelliSense, and as a result of that we don't have compile time error checking as well. Alright, and another thing to notice is, so this is a LINQ query. Now we want this query to be able to retrieve data from underlying SQL Server database, but can SQL Server understand this LINQ query? No, SQL Server can only understand transact SQL. So there has to be someone in between who is going to convert this LINQ query into transact SQL that the underlying database can understand. And who is that going to be? That is what is the LINQ provider's job. So LINQ to SQL is going to take that LINQ query, convert that into transact SQL, and send it to SQL Server database. And to prove that, we can actually fire up SQL Profiler and then run the application and see the corresponding transact SQL query that is generated. So let's run a trace, and then let's go ahead and run this. So now when we go to SQL Profiler, stop the trace, notice that this is what is the transact SQL that is generated. So here we have some dynamic SQL that is generated by LINQ to SQL provider. So when we execute this query, we should only get male employees. Right. So we have looked at the same example. Okay. Now we have seen how to write a LINQ query to work with databases. Now let's say, for example, I want to work with in-memory objects like an array. For example, let's say I have an integer array here. So integer array, let's call it numbers equal, let's say 1 to 10 numbers. And to just speed things up, I have already typed those numbers, so let's copy and paste it right there. So we have numbers from 1 to 10. Now out of these numbers, I want to retrieve even numbers and then display them within the grid view control. Okay, again, to achieve that we can use LINQ query. Okay, so let's comment this. So this one right here is LINQ to SQL, because this is going to work with LINQ to SQL provider and then convert that into a transact SQL. Now let's see how to work with objects in memory using LINQ query. So the same idea, gridview1 dot data source is going to be, so we first write the from keyword, and let's give this an alias from number in. So what is the data source here? Numbers, the array that is an in-memory object. Now what we want only even numbers. So I'm going to say where number mod 2 equals 0. So if we divide a number by 2 and if the remainder is 0, then we know for sure it's an even number. So that's what is the condition that we are specifying next to the where operator. And then what we want to do, if that is true, then we want to select such kind of a number. And this is, this logic is going to be applied on every number within this object, numbers, which is an array of numbers. Okay, and then simply invoke data bind. So now when we run this, we should actually say only the even numbers within the grid we control 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Now look at this. Within the example that we have looked at so far, we worked with different data sources. One data source here is transact SQL Server database, and the other data source is in-memory objects. But the LINQ query is pretty much similar. Okay, depending on the data source, it's not going to change that much. It is the actual SQL provider that is going to convert that LINQ query into a syntax that is specific to the underlying data source. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.